Mr. Bongino, you sit there comfortably as the Deputy Director of the FBI, yet your entire career record demonstrates a distinct pattern of weaponizing law enforcement against immigrants and marginalized communities. Ilhan Omar's voice cut through the stale air of the congressional hearing room, sharp and accusatory, carrying that familiar cadence she reserves for moments when she knows the cameras are rolling live. She stood poised at her microphone, wearing a designer hijab and a carefully curated expression of righteous indignation, clearly relishing this moment she had personally orchestrated to dismantle Dan Bongino on national television. Tonight, she continued, leaning into the theatricality of the moment, I intend to expose your systemic bias, your deep-seated corruption, and your discriminatory agenda for the entire world to witness. The progressive section of the gallery erupted in raucous applause, filled with supporters who had arrived hours early to watch their champion take down the Trump administration's provocative appointee. Every major network was present, with lenses from CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all trained on the witness table, broadcasting the Congressional Oversight Committee on Immigration System Integrity to millions of viewers. While the official title sounded bureaucratic, everyone inside the Beltway knew this was a show trial designed to pit the squad's rising star against a man known for his combative style and refusal to back down. Omar had spent weeks preparing for this confrontation, her staff compiling opposition research and coordinating with friendly media outlets to ensure maximum impact. Dan Bongino sat quietly at the witness table, a 50-year-old former NYPD officer and Secret Service agent who looked every bit the Queen's native he was. He wore a dark, well-tailored suit with a crisp white shirt and red tie, but it was his facial expression that threw Omar off her rhythm. He wasn't sweating, he wasn't fidgeting, and he certainly wasn't defensive. Instead, he wore a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, the kind of look a seasoned street cop gives a suspect who is talking themselves into a corner. The American people deserve to know the truth, Omar pressed on, her voice rising as she played to the back of the room, arguing that he used his power to harass refugees and implement racist policies. You claim to stand for law and order, but your actual agenda is discrimination against anyone who looks like me or prays like me. More camera flashes illuminated the room as applause rippled through the audience again, convincing Omar she was landing devastating blows. Bongino finally leaned into his microphone, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable grounded grit of working-class New York, cutting through the polished political jargon of D.C. Congresswoman, he began, his tone deceptively calm but commanding absolute authority. Before we dissect my record, I think it is high time we have a serious conversation about your record. We need to talk about immigration fraud. We need to talk about marriage fraud. And we need to have a very frank discussion about perjury and federal tax violations. He paused to let the words hang in the air, watching the color drain slightly from her face as the room went deathly silent. I have been a cop for 20 years, with 4 years in the NYPD and 12 in the Secret Service, and I have spent a lifetime investigating fraud and arresting criminals. I know what fraud looks like, I know what it smells like, and I know exactly when I am looking at it. And you, Congresswoman, are currently sitting on a mountain of evidence suggesting you have committed multiple federal crimes. And we are going to walk through every single one of them right here on national television. He reached down and produced a thick, meticulously organized binder filled with tabbed documents, placing it on the table with a heavy thud that echoed in the silence. You wanted to hold a hearing on immigration system integrity. So let's start with the integrity of your own application and how you seemingly defrauded the United States by marrying your own brother. The room exploded into chaos, with Omar's face transforming from confident righteousness to frozen shock in a fraction of a second. Her staffers began frantically whispering to one another, while her attorneys leaned forward, realizing the script had been flipped disastrously. This was not how the hearing was supposed to go, but Bongino was already settling into his chair, shifting fully into the mode of a lead investigator running an interrogation. "You want to talk about the system, so let's talk about your marriage to Ahmed Mertz said El-Mitar, a British citizen who, according to substantial documentary evidence, is your biological sibling." He opened the binder and pulled out the first set of documents, holding them up for the cameras to see clearly. "I have worked financial crimes, identity theft, and marriage fraud cases for decades. And what I am looking at here is a textbook example of how to game the system." Omar attempted to interrupt, shouting over him that these were disgusting racist conspiracy theories meant to silence her. "Documents are not racist, Congresswoman," Bongino replied, his voice firm and cutting through her protestations with the matter-of-fact tone of a detective reading a charge sheet. "Evidence is not racist. Facts are not racist. And shouting about bigotry does not change what is written on these papers." He held up the first document, pointing to the date, noting that in 2009 she legally married Ahmed Nur Saeed El-May in Hennepin County, Minnesota. "You were in your late 20s at the time, and you admitted to this marriage, so the existence of the union is not in dispute. Now, here is where the situation gets interesting, because we need to look at who exactly Ahmed Nur Saeed El-May is. I took the liberty of pulling his educational records from the United Kingdom, where he attended high school before coming to the United States. Bongino displayed official documents bearing British government seals, pointing to the line listing the father's name as Nur Saeed El-May. Now, let's compare that to your own refugee application documents from 1995 when your family first arrived in America. He held up a second document, placing it side by side with the first to show the committee the identical names listed for the father. The name is Nur Saeed El-May, exact same spelling, exact same man, listed as the father for both you and your husband. I am just a guy from Queens, and I don't have fancy degrees in mathematics, but where I come from, if two people have the same father, that makes them brother and sister." A collective gasp went through the gallery, and the sound of camera shutters accelerated into a frenzy like a swarm of cicadas. "That is just one piece of the puzzle," Bongino continued, his voice steady as he built his case brick by brick, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd. "Let's look at social media, specifically Instagram, because people often forget that the internet is forever even after they hit delete." He produced high-resolution printouts of archived posts from Ahmed El-May's account, dating back to 2013. In this post, Ahmed El-May shares a photo of himself with your daughter, the child you had with your previous partner, Ahmed Hirsi. The caption is what matters here, because he refers to her explicitly as his niece, not his stepdaughter. Bongino looked up at the committee, making eye contact with the chairman before turning back to Omar. "If he were just your husband, that child would be his stepdaughter, but he calls her his niece, because that is exactly what she would be if he were your brother." Omar was shaking her head violently, but she remained silent, her eyes darting between her lawyers who were now scribbling furiously on legal pads. "But wait, there is more," Bongino said, his energy rising as he sensed the momentum shifting entirely in his favor. "I have an email here, retrieved through a Freedom of Information Act request, sent from Ahmed El-May to you in 2011. He held the paper up and read the text slowly and clearly, ensuring every word landed with impact. It says, "Thanks for helping me get papers, sister. I will make sure to pay you back when I get to London." The word sister hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, silencing the few supporters who had been murmuring in Omar's defense. He called you sister in an email specifically about obtaining immigration papers, which is the exact definition of marriage fraud. You married your sibling to help him secure United States citizenship, or at the very least student visa status and in-state tuition benefits. I also have 6 separate affidavits, sworn statements under penalty of perjury from prominent members of the Minneapolis Somali community. These are people who knew your family in Somalia before the Civil War and who knew you when you settled in Minnesota. He lifted the stack of sworn statements, letting them drop back onto the table to emphasize their weight. Every single one of them identifies Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi as your biological brother, stating there is no doubt and no confusion about your relationship. One witness, Mrs. Fedumo Hassan, provided specific details about your family history that align perfectly with the documents I just showed you. Now, let's talk about the timeline, because this is where the fraudulent intent becomes crystal clear to any investigator. In 2002, you entered into a religious Islamic marriage with Ahmed Hirsi and had 2 children with him, though the marriage was never legally recognized. In 2008, you separated religiously from Hirsi, and then in 2009, you immediately legally married Elma, the man who shares your father. But here is the smoking gun. From 2009 to 2011, you, Ahmed Hirsi, and Ahmed Elmi all lived at the exact same address in Columbia Heights. He produced lease agreements, utility bills, and voter registration records showing all 3 names tied to the same apartment unit. You were living with the father of your children and your legal husband, who happens to be your brother, all under one roof at the same time. In 2009, immediately after marrying you, Elmi enrolled at North Dakota State University to take advantage of the student aid programs available to spouses of U.S. citizens. Bongino leaned forward, his expression hardening as he detailed the timeline of the alleged scam. He graduated in 2012, moved to Minneapolis, got evicted from public housing, and then returned to the UK. Mission accomplished. You then filed for divorce in 2017, signing a document under penalty of perjury stating you had no contact with him since June 2011. That statement is a felony if it is a lie, and I have the evidence right here that proves it was a lie. He produced a series of photos taken in London in 2015 showing Omar and Elmi standing together, clearly interacting 4 years after she claimed to have lost contact. That constitutes perjury, Congresswoman, which is a separate federal crime from the marriage fraud and the immigration fraud. Omar finally found her voice, though it was shaky and defensive, claiming these were all debunked conspiracy theories from racist blogs. Congresswoman, nothing I have presented today has been debunked. The UK government records are real, the school transcripts are real, and the photos are real. There is one simple way to debunk all of this instantly, and that is a DNA test. The room tensed as Bongino issued the challenge, spreading his hands wide to emphasize the simplicity of the solution. If he is not your brother, a simple cheek swab clears your name in 48 hours and makes me look like a fool. You have refused every request from the media and from your colleagues to take that test because you know exactly what the results would show. You know that test would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you committed federal immigration fraud to game the system. Omar began to weep, tears streaming down her face as she declared she would not dignify his racist attacks with a response. Bongino's voice turned ice-cold, shedding the conversational tone for the hard edge of a street cop who has heard every excuse in the book. I worked the 75th Precinct in East New York, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country, and I arrested people of every race and religion based on evidence, not bias. This isn't about your religion or your background. This is about the fact that immigration fraud is a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. You came to this country as a refugee, a country that saved your life and gave you citizenship, and you repaid that generosity by defrauding the very system that sheltered you. You hurt every legitimate refugee and every honest immigrant when you confirm the worst stereotypes about people gaming the system. We haven't even touched on your taxes yet, which is where the financial trail becomes impossible to deny. Bongino pulled a new section from his binder, referencing the investigative principle of following the money to uncover the truth. In 2014 and 2015, you filed joint federal tax returns with Ahmed Hirsi, the father of your children. The problem is that during those years, you were still legally married to Ahmed Elmi, which makes filing jointly with another man a federal crime. He cited Title 26 of the United States Code, reading the statute regarding making false statements on tax returns under penalty of perjury. You certified that those returns were true, yet you claimed to be married to a man who was not your legal husband. Omar interjected that she had corrected those filings, but Bongino cut her off immediately, noting that she only corrected them after being investigated. Correcting fraud after you get caught does not erase the crime. It simply serves as an admission of guilt. You signed those documents knowing they were false, which is tax fraud, plain and simple. Now, let's pivot to your campaign finances, specifically the hundreds of thousands of dollars paid to Tim Minette. Bongino produced Federal Election Commission filings and laid them out, creating a visual timeline of the payments. Your campaign paid his firm, the E Street Group, approximately $370,000 while you were having an affair with him. We know about the affair because his wife, Beth Minette, stated it in her divorce filings under oath, claiming her husband admitted he was in love with you. She also testified that Tim told her not to worry about money because Ilhan's campaign is covering everything. That statement, sworn in a court of law, suggests you were using donor money, funds from working-class people, to subsidize your romantic relationship. You eventually married him, and the payments from your campaign to his firm skyrocketed to over $2 million. You are effectively funneling campaign donations into your own household income by paying your husband's firm massive consulting fees. That is a glaring conflict of interest and potential money laundering of campaign funds for personal enrichment. Omar was now shaking her head, sobbing that it was unfair. But Bongino slammed his hand on the table, the sharp sound silencing her. What is unfair is taking money from people who believe in you and using it to destroy a marriage and enrich your lover. You have a pattern of believing the rules do not apply to you, from marriage fraud to tax fraud to campaign finance violations. You sit there and cry victim, but the evidence shows a predator who exploits every system she touches. You are wondering why you haven't been arrested, and the answer is simple: politics. You are a protected class in Washington, a rising star of the progressive left, and prosecutors are terrified of the backlash. They know that if they charge you, they will be branded as racists and Islamophobes, so they look the other way. But the statute of limitations is ticking, and not everyone is afraid to do their job. Tom Homan and the new leadership at the FBI are reviewing these files as we speak, looking for every avenue to hold you accountable. If it is proven that you obtained your citizenship through fraud, denaturalization is on the table, which means your citizenship could be revoked. And if your citizenship is revoked, deportation becomes a very real legal possibility. The fear in Omar's eyes was palpable now, the reality of his words piercing through her defensive shell. You should have followed the rules like everyone else, like the millions of immigrants who do it the right way. Instead, you broke the law repeatedly, counting on identity politics to shield you from the consequences. I want to ask you 7 simple questions, yes or no, to get this on the record. Is Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi your brother? Omar looked at her lawyers and refused to answer, calling the question baseless. Bongino noted the refusal and moved to the next question regarding her tax returns. Did you file joint returns with a man you weren't married to? She admitted the filings were amended, effectively confirming the fraud. He grilled her on the London photos, the divorce filings, and the campaign payments. And each time she deflected or refused to answer. This is what guilt looks like, Congresswoman. Innocent people are eager to clear their names, while guilty people hide. You won't take a DNA test because it would end your career and potentially send you to prison. You can leave this hearing and spin this however you want, but the American people have eyes, and they can see the truth. History will record that you came here as a refugee, rose to power, and then fell because you thought you were above the law. Bongino closed his binder with a finality that rang through the room, stating he was done presenting his evidence. The moment he finished, the room erupted into chaos as reporters scrambled to file their stories and aides rushed Omar out a side door. But the internet was already ablaze, with clips of the confrontation going viral within minutes across every platform. Hashtags demanding accountability trended worldwide, and the footage of Bongino dismantling her defense was played on a loop on cable news. Even liberal commentators struggled to defend the sheer volume of documentary evidence presented. Petitions demanding an investigation garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures in days, led by legal immigrants furious at the betrayal of the system. The political fallout was swift and brutal, with donors pulling their funding and primary challengers stepping forward to contest her seat. 6 months later, a defeated Ilhan Omar announced she would not seek re-election, citing family reasons, but everyone knew it was a forced resignation. The investigation remains active, with prosecutors reviewing the files for potential charges despite her departure from office. Dan Bongino, the street cop from Queens, had used the truth to expose corruption, proving that facts are the ultimate weapon against political spin. If this story matters to you, if you believe in the rule of law, share this and demand that justice be served, because no one should be above the law. The resignation was supposed to be the end of the story, a strategic retreat designed to save face and preserve whatever pension or future speaking fees Ilhan Omar could salvage from the wreckage of her political career. The establishment media immediately attempted to pivot, framing her departure as a tragic loss of a diverse voice and a victim of a right-wing smear campaign, hoping the news cycle would churn forward and the American public would forget the mountain of evidence Dan Bongino had dumped on that congressional table. But they underestimated the sheer momentum of the legal machinery that had been set in motion, and they vastly underestimated the resolve of a justice system that had been embarrassed for too long. Resigning from Congress does not grant immunity from past crimes, a fact that seemed to escape her legal team but was front and center in the minds of the federal investigators who were no longer held back by the delicate political sensitivities of investigating a sitting representative. The moment she signed that resignation letter, the protective shield of her office evaporated, leaving her exposed as a private citizen with a very public record of alleged felonies. The files that had been gathering dust in the Department of Justice, the dossiers that had been slow-walked by hesitant bureaucrats, suddenly moved to the top of the pile. Tom Homan, true to his word, and operating with the full backing of an administration tired of the double standards, publicly stated that the rule of law has no expiration date, and that resignation is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. The investigation transitioned from a political inquiry to a criminal probe with terrifying speed. Subpoenas began flying out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota, not just for Omar, but for her financial records, her campaign staff, and most critically, for the biometric data that had been the subject of so much speculation. You can ignore a reporter from the Daily Mail, and you can ignore a question from a political opponent, but you cannot ignore a federal grand jury subpoena without finding yourself in handcuffs for contempt. The narrative that she could simply fade away into the lucrative world of nonprofit consulting was shattered when the FBI executed a search warrant on her campaign headquarters and her private residence in Minneapolis. The images of federal agents in windbreakers carrying out boxes of documents and hard drives were broadcast live, a visual confirmation that this was not a political stunt, but a serious federal law enforcement operation. The agents were looking for the original financial records that would corroborate the digital trail of the money laundered through the E Street Group, but they were also looking for the original immigration documents that had been the genesis of the entire saga. Inside those boxes were the paper trails of a life built on layers of deception, the receipts of a fraud that spanned 2 continents and 3 decades. The grand jury met in secret, as they always do, but leaks began to trickle out that the testimony was damning. Members of the Somali community, the same people who had been too terrified to speak when she held the power of a congressional seat, suddenly found their courage. They came forward in droves, no longer fearing retribution, eager to clear the name of their community, which they felt had been unfairly tarnished by her actions. They testified about the family history, about the known relationship between her and Ahmed Elmi, and about the open secret that had been whispered in Minneapolis coffee shops for years. The wall of silence that had protected her for a decade crumbled brick by brick, brought down by ordinary people who simply wanted the truth to be known. Then came the day that changed everything, the day the indictment was unsealed. It wasn't just one charge. It was a laundry list of federal offenses that read like a criminal justice textbook. Conspiracy to commit immigration fraud, marriage fraud, multiple counts of perjury, filing false tax returns, and misuse of campaign funds. The headline screamed across every ticker in the country: former Congresswoman indicted. The arraignment was a spectacle, with heavy security and a media circus outside the federal courthouse. But inside, the atmosphere was cold and clinical. Gone was the defiant politician who lectured colleagues on morality. In her place stood a defendant, looking small and cornered, listening as the judge read the charges that carried a potential combined sentence of over 40 years in federal prison. Her lawyers entered a plea of not guilty, of course, recycling the same tired talking points about political persecution and bias, but the judge, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for strict adherence to procedure, cut them off. This is a court of law, he reminded them, not a cable news segment, and here we deal in evidence, not narratives. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming, structured not to win a popularity contest, but to secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. They didn't just rely on the documents Bongino had presented. They had gone deeper. They had subpoenaed records from the United Kingdom, obtaining the original birth registry data that linked the siblings through their father. They had forensic accountants trace every cent of the campaign money, showing a clear pattern of personal enrichment that violated the most basic tenets of election law. But the centerpiece of the prosecution's strategy was the move that everyone had been waiting for: the motion to compel a DNA test. The defense fought it tooth and nail, filing emergency motions and appeals, arguing that it was an invasion of privacy and an unnecessary search. They argued that the paper trail should be sufficient or insufficient on its own, desperate to avoid the one piece of scientific evidence that would make their client's guilt irrefutable. But the prosecution argued that since the core of the fraud charge hinged on the biological relationship, the DNA evidence was not just relevant, it was essential. The judge agreed. The order was issued. Ilhan Omar was legally compelled to provide a DNA sample, as was Ahmed Elma, who was facing his own set of charges and extradition requests in the UK. The day the results came back, the courtroom was packed to capacity, the air thick with tension. This was the moment of truth, the moment where all the gaslighting, all the denials, and all the accusations of racism would collide with hard, cold science. The forensic expert took the stand, a dry academic who spoke in percentages and probabilities, immune to the political radiation in the room. He walked the jury through the markers, the alleles, the statistical impossibilities of two unrelated people sharing such a genetic profile. When the prosecutor finally asked the ultimate question, based on your analysis, what is the probability that the defendant and Ahmed Noor Saeed Elma are siblings? The expert didn't hesitate. The probability is 99.999%, he stated flatly. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a decade of lies evaporating in an instant. There was no spin that could counter that number, no rhetoric that could undo the biological reality that they were brother and sister. The brother-husband was no longer a conspiracy theory. It was a forensic fact, entered into the permanent record of the United States District Court. The jury didn't need much time. The deliberations were short, almost perfunctory. The evidence was not just beyond a reasonable doubt. It was beyond any doubt whatsoever. Guilty on all counts. The verdict rang out, sealing her fate as a convicted felon. But for the prosecutors, and for the integrity of the system, the prison sentence was only the first half of the equation. The second half was the process of denaturalization. The Department of Justice filed a civil suit immediately following the criminal conviction, arguing that because Ilhan Omar had committed fraud during the immigration and naturalization process, she had never legally been a citizen in the first place. This is a legal principle known as void ab initio, void from the beginning. You cannot build a legal status on a foundation of lies. If you lie to get into the club, your membership isn't just cancelled. It's recognized as never having validly existed. The defense tried to argue that stripping her citizenship would leave her stateless, a violation of international human rights norms. But the government was prepared. They produced documents showing she still held Somali citizenship, as she had never formally renounced it in a way that was recognized by the Somali government. And even if she had, the fraud negated her American status regardless of the consequences. The message was clear. American citizenship is a privilege, a sacred compact. And if you obtain it by trickery, you forfeit it. The judge presiding over the denaturalization hearing was even sterner than the criminal judge. He noted that millions of people wait in line, pay their fees, undergo vetting, and follow every rule to become Americans. To allow someone who defrauded the system to keep the prize would be an insult to every legal immigrant in the nation. The ruling was swift. The certificate of naturalization issued to Ilhan Omar was hereby cancelled and revoked. In the eyes of the law, she was no longer a citizen, no longer a former congresswoman, but a foreign national convicted of aggravated felonies. And under U.S. immigration law, an aggravated felony makes a non-citizen immediately deportable. The transition from the courthouse to the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement was jarring. There were no special convoys, no Secret Service detail, just ICE officers in standard uniforms placing her in a transport van. The imagery was potent, a stark reminder that in a functioning republic, the law is the great leveler. It does not care if you once sat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, If you are an alien convicted of fraud, you are processed like anyone else. The deportation proceedings were the final act of this tragedy. Her team tried to claim asylum, arguing she would be persecuted if returned to Somalia, but the asylum claim was dead on arrival. You cannot claim asylum from a country you visited voluntarily for photo ops, and you certainly cannot claim it when your credibility has been destroyed by a criminal conviction for lying to immigration authorities. The immigration judge ordered her removal. The appeals were exhausted. The final order was signed. The day she boarded the plane was not a day of celebration, but a day of solemn validation for the rule of law. It wasn't about malice. It was about consequences. As the plane taxied down the runway, carrying the first member of Congress ever to be deported for immigration fraud, the national conversation shifted. The gaslighting lifted like a heavy fog. People realized they hadn't been crazy for questioning the story. That the bloggers and the independent journalists who had been smeared as racists were actually the only ones doing real reporting. Dan Bongino, watching the news from his studio, didn't gloat. He simply looked at the camera and reminded his audience that the system only works if people are willing to fight for it. He broke down the lesson for the millions watching, that corruption thrives when good people are afraid to speak up, and that identity politics is the ultimate shield for scoundrels. The precedent set was massive. It sent a shockwave through the political class, a warning that the vetting process for public office would no longer be a rubber stamp. It emboldened investigators to look into other cases of potential fraud that had been ignored for political reasons. The Omar precedent became a legal shorthand for the principle that fraud vitiates everything, that no amount of time or political success can wash away the original sin of a crime committed to enter the country. In Minneapolis, the Somali community breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had been held hostage by a representative who claimed to speak for them while exploiting the very laws that allowed them to be there. Ahmed Hassan, the refugee who had started the petition, was interviewed again. He stood tall, proud of his role in restoring integrity to the system. "This proves that America is a just country," he said. "In my old country, the powerful get away with everything. Here, even the powerful must answer to the law. That is why we love this country." His words resonated more than any pundit's analysis. The integrity of the immigration system had been defended, not by closing the door, but by ensuring that those who walked through it did so honestly. The media, forced to cover the deportation, had to eat humble pie. The same anchors who had rolled their eyes at the accusations 2 years prior were now reading teleprompter scripts detailing the forensic DNA evidence and the tax fraud convictions. They tried to frame it as a tragedy, but the public saw it as justice. The narrative of the victim finally collapsed under the weight of the reality of the criminal. And what of the money? The millions funneled to Tim Mynette's firm? The clawback lawsuits began. Donors sued for fraud, arguing their money was given under false pretenses. The Federal Election Commission, emboldened by the criminal convictions, levied the largest fines in its history against the campaign and the consulting firm. Tim Mynette faced his own legal nightmare. Charged with conspiracy and facing prison time, his firm dissolved, his reputation in tatters. The love affair, financed by donor dollars, ended in a federal penitentiary and bankruptcy court. It was a total dismantling of a corrupt enterprise. The lesson echoed in the halls of Congress. Ethics committees suddenly became more active. Financial disclosures were scrutinized with new intensity. The fear of being the next Omar forced a wave of compliance that had been absent for decades. The story of Ilhan Omar became a cautionary tale, taught in law schools and civics classes. It was the story of the American dream corrupted, And then the American justice system corrected. It proved that while the wheels of justice grind slow, they grind exceedingly fine. The delay had been frustrating, the years of gaslighting infuriating, but the conclusion was absolute. There was no ambiguity left, no unanswered questions. The DNA test had settled the biology, the bank records had settled the finances, and the deportation order had settled the status. The epilogue of her life was written not in the legislative history of the United States, but in the case files of the federal court system. And for Dan Bongino, the man who had been mocked for asking the questions, it was a vindication of a career spent chasing the truth. He didn't need an apology from the media. The empty seat in Congress and the one-way ticket to Mogadishu were validation enough. He closed his broadcast that night with a simple message to the American people. The truth is a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose, and it will defend itself. We let the lion loose, and it did its work. Now, let's get back to the business of saving this country. The screen faded to black, but the impact of the story remained. It was a restoration of faith. It was proof that the blindfold on Lady Justice hadn't slipped, that she could still weigh the evidence without seeing the identity of the accused. It was a hard victory, a messy victory, but a victory nonetheless. The Republic had survived a test of its own integrity, and in doing so, it had sent a message to the world that in the United States of America, the law is king, and no one, absolutely no one, wears a crown that sits higher than the Constitution. The enduring image was not of her speeches or her magazine covers, but of that final walk to the plain, a silent, stark testament to the fact that actions have consequences. The political machine had failed to protect her, the media had failed to cover for her, and the race card had failed to distract from her crimes. All that was left was the law, and the law had won. In the months following the deportation, the political landscape of Minnesota's 5th District transformed. The special election to fill her seat became a referendum on integrity. Candidates from both parties competed not on who could be the most radical, but on who could be the most transparent. The voters, burned by the betrayal, demanded to see tax returns, demanded to see full background checks, demanded to know exactly who they were sending to Washington. The era of the celebrity politician in that district was over. The era of the public servant had returned. The new representative, a boring, methodical, law-abiding individual, was exactly what the doctor ordered. There were no scandals, no headlines, just legislation and constituent services. It was quiet, and that quiet was the sound of a system healing itself. The squad itself fractured, its remaining members scrambling to distance themselves from their fallen comrade, suddenly very eager to show their own compliance with the rules. The power dynamic in Washington shifted. The intimidating aura of the progressive left, which had relied on the accusation of racism to silence critics, was punctured. Bongino's investigation had provided a blueprint for how to defeat identity politics. Ignore the noise, focus on the documents, and never, ever stop digging. Other investigators picked up the torch, looking into other politicians with renewed vigor. The standard had been raised. If they could take down a congresswoman for marriage fraud, they could take down anyone for anything. It was a new day for accountability. And somewhere in East Africa, a former congresswoman sat in a reality she had tried to outrun for half her life, stripped of the power and the prestige she had obtained through fraud, living with the consequences of the choices she made when she thought no one was watching. But the American people were watching. And in the end, they saw everything. The long nightmare of deception was over, and the morning had come. The Republic stood, the law prevailed, and the truth, as it always does, had the final word. The deportation of Ilhan Omar was not merely the closing of a chapter, but the violent opening of an entirely new book in American political history, sending tremors through the bedrock of Washington that would be felt for a generation. The immediate aftermath was defined by a terrified silence that descended upon the Capitol, a palpable dread gripping the corridors of power where arrogance had once reigned supreme. Staffers who had previously walked with the swagger of untouchables now moved quietly, shredding documents and scrubbing hard drives, terrified that the spotlight of forensic accountability would swing in their direction next. The Omar precedent had shattered the unspoken truce among the political elite, the gentleman's agreement that said private corruption would be overlooked as long as public decorum was maintained. Tom Homan and the revitalized Department of Justice did not pack up their boxes and go home. Instead, they viewed the conviction as a proof of concept, a signal that the impenetrable armor of identity politics had finally been pierced by the lance of the law. A special task force was quietly assembled within the FBI, distinct from the regular bureaucracy, hand-picked by leadership that aligned with Bongino's philosophy of absolute adherence to the Constitution. Their mandate was terrifyingly simple: conduct a comprehensive retrospective audit of the naturalization files of every foreign-born individual holding high public office or security clearances in the federal government. This was not a witch hunt, as the breathless editorials in the New York Times claimed, but a necessary hygiene measure for a republic that had neglected its immune system for too long. The logic was irrefutable. If a sitting congresswoman could hide a fraudulent marriage to a sibling for a decade, who else had slipped through the cracks during the years of lax vetting? The audit, dubbed Operation Glass House, began to churn through terabytes of data, cross-referencing old immigration forms with modern biometric databases, looking for the discrepancies that signal a lie. Panic set in among the lobbying firms and the consulting groups that thrived on the connections of the Squad and their allies, as the realization hit that the gravy train wasn't just derailed. The tracks had been torn up. The financial fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the progressive movement, which saw its fundraising infrastructure collapse overnight as donors fled from the toxicity of potential criminal associations. Major corporations, risk-averse by nature, issued internal memos prohibiting donations to any candidate with unresolved background questions, effectively blacklisting a significant portion of the radical left. Meanwhile, the media landscape was undergoing a tectonic shift of its own, forced to reckon with its complicity in shielding a criminal enterprise for years. The ratings for networks that had aggressively defended Omar plummeted to historic lows as viewers tuned out in disgust, feeling betrayed by the anchors who had looked them in the eye and called the evidence racist conspiracy theories. Trust is a currency that is hard to earn and easy to spend, and the mainstream press had spent their last dime defending the indefensible. Investigative journalism, which had been on life support in the corporate press, experienced a renaissance in the independent sphere, inspired by Bongino's relentless pursuit of the facts. A new generation of reporters, unburdened by corporate leashes or cocktail party social climbing, began digging into the archives, looking for the next story, the next fraud, the next betrayal. They realized that the Omar story was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a deeper rot, a systemic failure where ideology had been allowed to supersede the law. The Squad itself, once a monolith of unified messaging, began to fracture under the pressure of the new reality, with members turning on each other to save their own skins. Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, previously inseparable from Omar, suddenly found themselves too busy to comment, scrubbing their social media history of photos with the disgraced former congresswoman. It was a brutal lesson in political Darwinism. In Washington, friendship ends is exactly where the indictment begins. The focus of the investigation soon broadened beyond just the politicians to the bureaucrats who had enabled the fraud, the deep state functionaries who had stamped the papers and looked the other way. Investigators began pulling the employment records of the immigration officers who had approved Omar's applications in 2009 and the supervisors who had signed off on the lax vetting protocols. It was discovered that a culture of approving to clear the queue had permeated the agencies, where asking too many questions was seen as an impediment to efficiency rather than a necessary security measure. Administrative subpoenas were issued to retired civil servants, dragging them back from their Florida condos to answer for the rubber stamps they had wielded so carelessly decades ago. The message was being sent loud and clear to the current workforce. Your signature on a government form is a solemn oath, and accountability for that oath does not expire when you clock out. This led to a massive internal purge within the Department of Homeland Security, with revised protocols that mandated biometric DNA verification for family-based immigration claims from high-fraud regions. The loophole that Omar had exploited, the reliance on paper documents from failed states without forensic verification, was permanently closed, slammed shut by the heavy hand of a government that refused to be embarrassed again. Back in Minneapolis, the healing process was underway, led by the very community that Omar had claimed to represent but had actually held hostage. Ahmed Hassan, the whistleblower who had started it all, became a local hero, a symbol of the integrity of the Somali-American community that wanted nothing to do with fraud. He organized town halls and civic education seminars, teaching new immigrants the importance of following the law and the dangers of listening to demagogues who promised shortcuts. The district, which had been a lightning rod for national controversy, slowly returned to being a normal American community, concerned with snow removal, school boards, and small business loans rather than international intrigue. The replacement for Omar's seat was a quiet, unassuming moderate who campaigned on a platform of boring competence, a slogan that resonated deeply with a weary electorate. But the story had a global dimension as well. As Ilhan Omar attempted to reinvent herself in exile, landing in Mogadishu with a chip on her shoulder and a thirst for revenge, she attempted to position herself as a martyr for the global South, a victim of American imperialism, launching a podcast and a non-profit organization funded by dubious international sources. She railed against the racist American system to anyone who would listen, trying to foment anti-American sentiment from abroad, hoping to remain relevant on the world stage. However, the United States government was not finished with her yet, and the long arm of the Treasury Department reached out to strangle her financial lifelines. Because her citizenship had been revoked due to fraud, and because she had been convicted of financial crimes involving campaign funds, she was placed on a specifically designated nationals list that made banking virtually impossible. Her assets in the U.S. were seized to pay the restitution orders and the fines, leaving her with frozen accounts and a rapidly shrinking circle of friends. The State Department issued warnings to foreign governments and NGOs that doing business with a convicted felon who had defrauded the U.S. government would have serious diplomatic consequences. Slowly but surely, the doors closed, the phone calls stopped being returned, and the podcast microphone was turned off due to lack of funding. She learned the hard way that without the platform of the U.S. Congress and the protection of American citizenship, she was just another shouting voice in a chaotic world. Back in the U.S., the legal precedents established during her denaturalization trial began to reshape immigration law in profound ways, cited in courtrooms across the country. The void ab initio doctrine was applied to revoke the citizenship of dozens of other individuals found to have lied on their applications, ranging from war criminals to common fraudsters. The message was no longer theoretical. It was operational, with ICE creating a specialized unit dedicated solely to denaturalization investigations based on the Omar Protocol. Dan Bongino, having successfully navigated the storm, transitioned his focus from the specific case of Omar to the broader structural reforms needed to prevent a recurrence. He used his massive platform to advocate for the Integrity and Public Service Act, a piece of legislation that would require full background audits and tax releases for all federal candidates. The bill, initially resisted by the establishment, gained unstoppable momentum as the public demanded to know who exactly was writing their laws. Bongino argued that if a police officer needs a background check to carry a badge, a congressperson should need an even stricter one to vote on the budget. The hearings for this new legislation were packed, with Bongino testifying as the star witness, laying out the timeline of the Omar case as the primary evidence for why the system needed an overhaul. He didn't scream or shout. He simply laid out the vulnerability of a system that operated on the honor system in an era of dishonorable men and women. The legislation passed with bipartisan support, mostly because voting against it was political suicide in the post-Omar climate. The cultural impact of the saga was perhaps the most enduring legacy, as it broke the spell of identity politics that had paralyzed honest discourse for a decade. Americans realized that accusing someone of a crime was not an attack on their race or religion, but an attack on their conduct, and that shielding a criminal because of their identity was the true bigotry. Comedy and satire, which had been stifled by political correctness, began to return, with late-night hosts finally feeling safe enough to joke about the absurdity of marrying one's brother. The tension in the country eased slightly as the double standard was removed. People felt that justice, while delayed, was still possible. The Omar case became a case study in law schools, analyzed not for the politics, but for the forensic accounting and the immigration statutes. Students learned about the fruit of the poisonous tree in the context of her fraudulent application, understanding that every subsequent success she achieved was legally tainted. The FBI files on the case, eventually released with redactions, became bestsellers in book form, reading like a spy novel but serving as a historical record. The detailed breakdown of how the fraud was executed, the cover-ups, and the eventual exposure served as a warning to future grifters. But amidst the structural and legal changes, there was a personal toll on the people who had been caught in the crossfire, particularly the families destroyed by the affairs and the deception. Beth Minette, whose husband had been stolen and whose family had been dragged through the mud, found a quiet dignity in the vindication, rebuilding her life away from the spotlight. She became a silent advocate for ethics reform, her story a testament to the human cost of political corruption. Her ex-husband, Tim Minette, sat in a federal prison cell, a man who had traded his integrity for a slice of power and lost everything in the gamble. He became a cautionary tale in the world of political consulting, the man who flew too close to the sun on wings made of stolen donor money. The consulting industry cleaned up its act, terrified of the scrutiny, implementing strict conflict of interest policies that had previously been ignored. The cleanup extended to the universities as well, with North Dakota State University revoking the degree awarded to Ahmed Elmi, citing the fraudulent basis of his student status. It was a symbolic move, but one that reinforced the total erasure of the gains made through the fraud. The academic record was corrected, the marriage record was annulled, the citizenship was revoked, and the legacy was deleted. History, which is often written by the victors, was in this case written by the evidence. And the evidence was unforgiving. As the years passed, The name Ilhan Omar shifted from a rallying cry to a footnote, a synonym for hubris and the inevitable fall that follows. The Republic moved on, scarred but smarter, wary but resilient, having survived an infection by developing the necessary antibodies. Dan Bongino looked out at the changed landscape, knowing that the fight was never truly over, but satisfied that a major battle had been decisively won. He understood that liberty is not a self-sustaining machine. It requires the constant maintenance of vigilance and the occasional controlled burn of corruption. The Omar affair was that controlled burn, a fire that cleared the underbrush of lies and allowed the truth to grow back, stronger and straighter than before. The final pages of the saga were not written in ink, but in the restored confidence of the American people, who saw that even in the highest halls of power, the truth could still kick down the door. The American experiment, tested by fraud and strained by division, had proven its durability, correcting itself through the mechanisms designed by the founders. It was a messy, loud, and painful process, but in the end, the system worked exactly as it was designed to. And in the quiet moments, in the voting booths and the town halls, the citizens remembered. They remembered that they were the ultimate arbiters of truth, and that no amount of spin could hide the reality of a DNA test. The ghost of the scandal lingered only as a guardian, a reminder to every future aspirant to office. Tell the truth, follow the law, or prepare to be exposed. The chapter was closed, the book was shelved, and America turned the page to face the future, eyes wide open.